Okay, what is up there YouTube? This is a J-Man Time, and today I have a video on one of the most forgotten Italian tanks of the early 20th century. And this tank here is technically the grandfather of almost all Italian tanks, with the exception of one tank that came before it. And that tank is the Fiat 2000. An Italian experimental heavy tank project from 1917. The Fiat 2000 was an Italian heavy tank project developed between 1916 and 1917, when the first prototype was unveiled in early 1918 during the First World War. This vehicle was supposed to be the standard issued Italian tank towards the end of 1918. Some 50 of these heavy tanks were actually ordered from the Fiat company by the Italian military for use in World War I. But ultimately, only 2 prototypes were built between 1917 and 1918. The Fiat 2000 had a weight of 40 tons, weighing 22 tons more than the standard British tank of the war, the Mark 1 through 5 series, which weighed 28 tons. The main armament of the Fiat 2000 was one 65mm Cannonade 6.5-17 model 1908 howitzer. Now this tank, like the Renault FT-17, was one of only a handful of tanks designed with a fully rotating turret. But unlike the FT-17, the turret of the Fiat 2000 was pretty large and had enough room for 2 men. The secondary armament was a 6.5mm Fiat Viability model 1914 heavy machine guns. These were the standard machine guns used by the Italian Ground Army. Later on, in 1934, 2 of the guns were replaced with 2 37mm Vickers Turney -37-40 tank guns, and these were anti-tank guns or tank guns that were the standard issued Italian tank guns used on the Fiat 2000's replacement, the Fiat 3000 light tank, which also served during the interwar years with the Fiat 2000. The armor thickness was 15 to 20 millimeters, making it one of the stronger tanks of World War I, with only the German A7V having a thicker armor. The speed of this vehicle was pretty slow at just 7 kilometers per hour or 4.3 miles per hour, making the speed of this tank not much greater than the standard British Mark 1 through 5 series, and these vehicles were slower than the Renault FT-17. The crew capacity was 10, so this tank had just as many crewmen as the German A7V Sturmpanzerwagen, which was the standard German medium heavy tank used by the German army in the First World War. Now, the Fiat 2000's development took way too long, and as a result, only 2 tanks were built out of the original planned batch of 50. 50 tanks were supposed to be completed by the end of 1918, and only 2 prototypes were completed by the time the war came to an end in November 1918. As a result, the Italians only adopted these 2 vehicles for use during the interwar era between 1919 and 1938. During this time period, the Fiat 2000 actually served in Libya, along with the Fiat 3000, during the pacification of Libya, also known as the Second Italian Senussis War. There was a war going on between the Bedouin tribes of the Cyrenaica region, known as the Senussis, and they were fighting against the Italian occupation force. And this conflict lasted from 1922 until 1933. The Senussis had an army of about 100,000 Bedouin tribesmen versus about 150,000 Italian colonial troops, armed with 1 Fiat 2000 and at least 100 of the Fiat 3000 series of light tanks and hundreds of armored cars. The Senussis had no tanks and mostly relied on infantry weapons and some artillery. But ultimately, the Senussis forces led by Omar Mukhtar was eventually overrun by late 1928, and the revolt/insurgency against the Italian forces ended in 1933, just 2 years before Italy would go to war with neighboring Ethiopia. During this time period, one of the Fiat 2000s was based in Libya in the city of Tripoli and later on Misrata, but that tank later broke down in 1934. The second Fiat 2000 tank was based in Rome, Italy, and was used during various parades in which Mussolini would review the Italian army. including many of the tanks and armored cars that were being used, and the Fiat 2000 based in Rome was one of the few vehicles seen at this parade. These parades lasted until 1938. The final Fiat 2000 tank was last spotted in 1936 in Rome, Italy. Afterwards, the vehicle was most likely decommissioned and was probably sold for scrap later on during the Second World War. There are some rumors that the tank was actually used as a monument between 1936 and 1941, but ultimately the tank was dismantled for scrap metal during the Second World War, thus ending the history of the first tank to be adopted by the Italians and Italy's first heavy tank. Now, some believe that the Fiat 2000 could have been useful during the Second World War. I would say this is largely not true, as this tank was pretty slow, and by World War II, most tanks had an average speed of between 15 and 40 miles per hour depending on the make and model. So a tank with a speed of just 4.3 miles per hour isn't going to do diddly squat in the Second World War. Secondarily speaking, the 65mm howitzer had very little armor penetration. The Italians did develop some anti-tank rounds for the 65mm gun that could penetrate at least 28mm of armor at 500 to 1,000 yards. They could have been useful with the main gun of the Fiat 2000, but by the time World War II came around, only one prototype of the Fiat 2000 was still in service, and I highly doubt that single tank would have made any dent in the Allied forces in World War II. If it was going to be useful anywhere, I guess it would be useful in East Africa, in places like Eritrea and Ethiopia and Somaliland, where the Italians have very few tanks. I think the most common tank was the L333 series of tank hits, and at least some of the Fiat M1139 series of medium tanks, which had the main gun in the chassis. So I guess the lone prototype would be useful in that battlefield, but they still would have been overrun as this vehicle was very slow and it was very large, which would have made it a very easy target for the British Air Force or the Royal Air Force. Remember, the British Air Force was used to destroy Italian and German tanks during the fighting in North Africa. And a big tank like the Fiat 2000 would be a big target. Even if the Italians were to mass produce the Fiat 2000 as a standard issue tank, and let's say the original batch of 50 were completed and were used in World War II, they still would have little to no effect. The 37mm guns added later on in 1934 would be somewhat useful, as they had an armor penetration of at least 22 to 47mm at ranges of 1,000 to 1,500 yards. So they could take out most of the British light tanks and some early cruiser tanks, but tanks like the Matilda II would overrun the Fiat 2000. And the Fiat 2000's main weakness was its armor thickness of only 15 to 20mm, so the standard British 2-pounder 40mm anti-tank gun would have no problem defeating the Fiat 2000, and that slow speed of 4.3 miles per hour would make it a pretty juicy target for British anti-tank crews. So its usefulness, or its perceived usefulness in World War II, would have been pretty lackluster during the Second World War. And there you have it. This was the Fiat 2000, Italy manufactured during the First World War, although the tank itself never served in World War I. So what do you all think of the Fiat 2000? Please tell me in the comments section below. And until next time, this was J-Man Time, signing off.